Nobody asked her where she had been before. That was the first mistake. She arrived at the forward operating base with a medical bag, a set of orders, and a name none of them recognized. They called her the nurse. They said it the way people say a word when they mean something smaller than the word itself. She smiled at nothing and spoke only when there was something worth saying. I watched her from the first day, and I could not place what it was about her that felt different. Not wrong. Different. Like something held very still on purpose. 3 weeks later, when the perimeter collapsed and the shooting started, and every person in that tent had to decide in 1 second who they actually were, she was the only one who already knew. I want to describe the forward operating base the way it actually was, not the way it gets described in the accounts that come later, when people are trying to make sense of things and the truth gets smoothed into something more manageable. It was a temporary medical facility attached to a SEAL support operation in a part of the world where the geography itself felt hostile, dry, pale, enormous in a way that made you feel the smallness of everything you had built inside it. The base was functional rather than comfortable. Plywood walls, canvas roofing in sections, generators that ran on a schedule to conserve fuel. The medical tent was the cleanest space on the compound, which still did not make it clean in any conventional sense. It smelled of antiseptic and dust and the particular staleness of air that has been cycled too many times through too small a space. I was a SEAL medic, a Special Operations Corpsman, which meant I had trained extensively and had field experience. But I was not a physician, and in a facility like ours, a deployed nurse with surgical support training was the closest thing to one we would regularly see. Our team rotated through the base on an 8-week cycle. We had been there for 5 weeks when Lieutenant Commander Vasquez arrived. The team I was embedded with was small and tight in the way that teams become when they have been under pressure together long enough that the social performance falls away. There were 7 of us who operated as a core unit. Kessler, who was senior in rank, and ran the team with a quiet authority that I had come to respect over 2 prior deployments. Reyes, who was the loudest among us, and compensated for genuine intelligence with the performance of not taking anything seriously. Torres, Nakamura, Webb, and Grant, each of them specific in the way that people become specific when you have shared small spaces and high-stakes situations with them long enough to know their defaults under pressure. And myself. We were not, as a group, particularly welcoming to outsiders. That is not a criticism. It is a description of what operational cohesion produces as a byproduct. We trusted each other because we had built that trust through accumulated evidence. Someone new had not yet provided evidence. That was the framework through which we processed new arrivals, and we applied it without cruelty but also without apology. When Lieutenant Commander Vasquez arrived and was introduced as the new nursing officer for the medical facility, the team processed her through that framework. She was female, which in itself was unremarkable. We had worked with women in various roles across multiple deployments and had long since moved past whatever adjustment that might have required in an earlier era. What registered with the team, instead, was the particulars of her presentation. She was calm in a way that read, to some of the team, as detachment. She did not perform warmth or eagerness. She responded to introductions with her name and a nod and then began reviewing the medical facility's inventory. Reyes made a comment that evening at Chow, something dismissive about the desk assignment they had apparently sent us. He said it with a grin, the way Reyes said most things, half performance and half test, waiting to see who would laugh and who would push back. Kessler did not laugh. He also did not push back. He ate his food and said nothing, which was its own kind of response, and Reyes moved on. I said nothing either. But I had been watching Vasquez during the introductions, and I had noticed something that I filed away without analyzing. When she had walked through the medical tent, she had not walked the way a person walks through a space they are seeing for the first time. She had walked through it the way you walk through a space you are assessing, moving with a purpose that went past orientation into something that looked more like tactical evaluation. She noted the exits. She noted the placement of the equipment. She looked at the sight lines from each position in the tent briefly, as though the information was being stored rather than admired. I had seen that kind of spatial attention in people who had been trained to think about environments as problems to be solved. I noted it. I told myself she was simply thorough. I went back to my duties. The base settled into its routines. Vasquez became part of the landscape, present, competent, undemanding of attention. She did her work. She asked precise questions when precision was required. She offered no personal information. The team absorbed her the way a system absorbs a new variable it has not yet classified. That unclassified quality was the thing that stayed with me. I could not place her, and I was someone who had learned to place people quickly. She did not fit the pattern I had for what a deployed nurse looked like under these conditions. She fit a different pattern, one I could not yet name. The discomfort, when it began, did not announce itself. It came in the form of small observations that accumulated without connecting, the kind of thing you notice peripherally, and do not examine because each individual instance has an easy explanation. I have thought about this since, about how much the mind will do to preserve the coherence of the picture it has already built. How much work goes into not seeing what is in front of you. The first instance was in the second week. A supply-resupply had brought in some new medical equipment, and there was a question about whether one of the pieces, a portable defibrillator with a configuration none of our team had seen before, was properly calibrated for our altitude and temperature conditions. The question went to Vasquez. She looked at the equipment for a moment and then adjusted 3 settings in sequence efficiently without referencing the manual that was sitting on the table beside her. She said the calibration should hold, but to run a test cycle before relying on it in a live situation. Webb, who was nearby, asked how she knew the adjustment sequence without the manual. She said she had worked with the model before. That was a reasonable answer. I accepted it. Something in the speed of it, the absence of the slight hesitation that even experienced people show when working from memory rather than present instruction, had been slightly off. Not wrong. Off. The second instance was during a perimeter awareness briefing that Kessler ran for all base personnel, including attached support staff. It was standard orientation, where to go, what to do, how to move if the base came under threat. Vasquez sat through it with the same composed attention she brought to everything. At the end, when Kessler opened for questions, she asked one. She asked about the sightline vulnerability on the northwest side of the medical tent and whether the generator placement on that side had been evaluated as a potential cover risk. The tent was silent for a moment. Kessler looked at her. He said the question was a good one and that it had been noted in prior assessments. He did not ask how she had come to think about the northwest corner in those terms. Later, Reyes said to me with less humor than usual that the nurse thought like a security analyst. I said maybe she had done some reading. Reyes looked at me for a moment and then changed the subject. There was a third instance that I find hardest to describe because it was less about what she did and more about what she did not do. A helicopter came in one afternoon with 2 wounded from a contact situation about 40 kilometers out, not our team, another unit passing through. The casualties were moderate gunshot wounds, one significant, one manageable. Vasquez ran the intake assessment. What I noticed was not her clinical competence, which was evident and expected. It was the way her body moved during the intake. Most medical personnel, even experienced ones, carry a particular tension during a trauma intake, a heightened alertness that manifests physically in the shoulders, the jaw, the speed of movement. It is the body's response to high-stakes urgency. Vasquez had none of it. She moved through the intake with the same economical calm she brought to inventory checks and routine assessments. Not because she did not understand the stakes. Her actions made clear she understood them precisely. But because her nervous system had apparently already adapted to this level of intensity to the point where it no longer registered as exceptional. You develop that kind of calm through one of 2 things, either a very long career of repeated exposure or exposure of a specific kind. Concentrated, extreme, occurring in conditions where calm was not a preference but a survival requirement. She was, according to her personnel file, 31 years old. The duration of career required to develop that calm through ordinary experience did not fit. I had done the rough math without fully admitting I was doing it. Kessler found me cleaning equipment that evening and said, without preamble, that he had put in a records inquiry. He did not say on who. He did not need to. I said nothing. He went back to his quarters. I finished cleaning the equipment and thought about the northwest corner of the medical tent and the woman who had been the one to identify it as a vulnerability. The records inquiry came back incomplete, which was itself a kind of information. Kessler told me this in the same quiet, factual way he told me everything. He said the service record associated with Vasquez's file had been partially restricted, certain sections flagged for clearance levels above the standard access available to his request. What he could see was a service entry date, a nursing qualification date, and a current assignment. What he could not see was everything in between, and the gap between the entry date and the qualification date was 4 years. 4 years unaccounted for in the accessible record. Kessler said he had submitted a follow-up request through a different channel. He said it would take time. He said in the meantime, we were working with what we had, which was a nursing officer who did her job and had not given us any reason for operational concern. He said it the way he said things when he had already reached a conclusion, but was choosing to hold it lightly until he had confirmation. I agreed with his approach. But I started paying attention differently. What I noticed, once I was paying that kind of attention, was a layering I had not seen clearly before. Vasquez interacted with patients in two distinct registers. The first was the one everyone saw, warm in a minimal, functional way, focused entirely on clinical need, efficient and precise. The second was something I only caught in peripheral moments, in the seconds between one task and the next when she did not know she was being observed. In those moments, her attention went outward rather than inward. She was watching the perimeter. Not obviously, not with any performance of vigilance, just a habitual low-level external awareness that is not part of nursing training and is not something most people develop without a specific reason to. I mentioned this to Tors one afternoon, carefully, without framing it as a concern. Tors was quiet for a moment, and then said he had noticed that she always sat with her back to a wall. In the mess tent, in briefings, in any space where seating was a choice rather than an assignment. Always with her back to a wall and her eyes toward the primary entrance. That is a specific behavioral adaptation. It is not learned in a hospital. It is learned in places where the question of who enters a room and how quickly you can assess them is not theoretical. I ran the timeline myself, privately. If Vasquez had entered military service at the standard age, and if 4 years of her record were restricted, and if she had emerged from that period with both a nursing qualification and a set of behavioral adaptations consistent with high-intensity operational experience, then there were a limited number of explanations for what those 4 years contained. The most likely explanation was not one that fit the title she currently carried. There was an evening in the third week when the question almost surfaced directly. We had a shared meal, several of us, with Vasquez present, and the conversation moved the way it sometimes does in those settings, loosely, across topics, with the comfortable irreverence of people who have shared enough discomfort to stop performing in front of each other. Someone, I think it was Grant, made a comment about a piece of equipment and used a piece of jargon that was specific to a particular branch of service. Not nursing, not medical corps, something more specific. Vasquez did not react visibly, but her eyes moved briefly with a recognition that she controlled quickly. If I had not been watching, I would not have caught it. The recognition of the jargon was automatic, which meant it was not second-hand knowledge. It was embedded. I looked at Kessler across the table. He was looking at his food, but his jaw had tightened slightly the same way it did when he was processing something he had not yet decided how to address. Nobody said anything. The conversation moved on. That night I lay on my cot in the half-dark of the sleeping quarters and I went through everything I had accumulated, the calibration sequence, the northwest corner, the trauma intake comm, the back-to-the-wall positioning, the jargon recognition. The 4 restricted years. I did not have a conclusion, but I had a shape, an outline of something that was much larger than the frame it was currently being held in. And the shape of it, once I could see it, was impossible to unsee. When I brought it to Ray's, which I did the next morning, he told me I was reading too much into things. He did not say it unkindly. Ray's rarely said things unkindly, even when he was being dismissive. He said it with the easy confidence of someone who had already categorized the situation and did not feel the need to revisit the categorization. He said that support staff came with all kinds of backgrounds, that nursing in austere environments attracted people who were not typical, and that a woman who sat with her back to walls and asked good questions about sightlines was just someone who had done her homework before deploying. He said I was looking for something to explain why she made me uncomfortable, and that the explanation was simpler than I was making it. She was just different from what we were used to, and different felt suspicious when you had been operating in a closed unit environment long enough. I considered that. It was not an unreasonable argument. I had seen people pattern match incorrectly before, had seen experienced operators convince themselves of things that turned out to be projections rather than readings. The operational environment does things to your perception over time, heightens some sensitivities past their useful range, creates false signals in the noise. But I had also learned, over 2.5 deployments, to trust the distinction between anxiety reading and actual reading, and what I was doing did not feel like anxiety. It felt like the particular alertness that comes when your pattern recognition is working correctly and what it is finding does not fit the category you have been given. I let it go with Ray's, but I did not let it go internally. Webb was the next person I tested it with less directly. I raised the behavioral observations without framing them as concern, just as items I had noticed. Webb listened, which was his nature, and then said something that stayed with me. He said the thing about people who have been through certain kinds of training is that the training does not switch off. It becomes the default state, and the default state is always visible to people who know what they are looking at. He said it as though he were speaking generally, But he looked at me with a directness that suggested he was not speaking generally. I asked him what he thought the restricted years were. He said he did not know. He said Kessler's second inquiry had apparently also come back with limitations, though with a different kind of limitation, not a blanket restriction but a referral to a separate oversight office, which meant the restriction was not standard. It was deliberate. He said we should wait. He said Kessler would handle it through proper channels and we would have clarity when we had clarity. And in the meantime, she had not done anything wrong and had in fact done several things right, and the appropriate posture was watchful patience. I agreed. I was good at watchful patience as a skill. What I was less good at was the feeling underneath it, the low, insistent dissonance of knowing that the frame you have been given for a situation is incorrect, but not yet having the correct frame to replace it with. The team's overall attitude toward Vasquez during this period was complicated in a way that I think deserves honesty. Reyes had settled into a kind of grudging neutrality. He no longer made dismissive comments, but he also did not engage with her directly more than operational necessity required. Grant and Torres were professional, civil, and largely indifferent. Nakamura had developed a kind of quiet respect that was based entirely on the quality of her work, which was the cleanest approach and probably the correct one. Kessler was watchful. He always was. But his watchfulness had a different texture now, less the general vigilance of a team leader managing a mixed personnel environment, and more the specific attention of someone who has filed a question and is waiting for the answer. Vasquez herself remained exactly as she had been from the first day. If she was aware of the scrutiny, and I think she was aware, because awareness was something her entire behavioral profile suggested she maintained continuously, she showed nothing. She came in for her shifts, she did her work, she ate her meals with her back to the wall and her eyes on the entrance, and she said exactly as much as each situation required and nothing more. 3 days later, the perimeter alarm went off at 2 in the morning, and everything I had been trying to name became suddenly and completely visible. The alarm was not a drill. We knew that within the first 30 seconds because of the quality of the sound, not the 2-pulse test cycle, but the continuous tone that meant a confirmed breach, and because Kessler's voice came over the internal comm immediately, and his voice had the particular compression that meant what was happening was real. The situation, as it came to us in pieces over the following minutes, was this. A small armed group had approached the base perimeter from the northwest, from the side that Vasquez had identified as a sightline vulnerability in the briefing 3 weeks earlier. They had not breached the outer wire, but they had moved to within a range that required immediate defensive posture and the activation of the base's emergency protocol, which included moving non-combatant personnel to the secondary shelter and preparing the medical facility for potential mass casualty intake. I was in the medical tent within 90 seconds of the alarm. Kessler had positioned the team on the defensive perimeter and had sent Webb back to oversee the medical shelter protocol, since Webb had the additional emergency response certification. When I entered the tent, Vasquez was already there. She was not doing what I expected. What the protocol called for was preparation for casualty intake, clearing space, organizing supplies, running the pre-positioning checklist that all medical personnel were trained to execute at the start of an emergency event. She had done all of that. It was already done. In the time between the alarm and my arrival, she had cleared and organized the space, run the checklist, and positioned herself at the tent entrance where she was observing the northwest approach with the kind of steady, calculating attention that had nothing to do with nursing. Webb came in behind me. He looked at the tent, the preparation, the positioning, the speed of it, and then he looked at Vasquez and something shifted in his face. She turned when she heard us. She assessed us both in a single sweep and then said, evenly, that the approach from the northwest suggested a group that knew the base layout, which meant either surveillance intelligence or a source inside the support network, and that if the breach escalated to a close engagement, the medical tent's current entry configuration created a single-point vulnerability on the left flank that could be partially addressed by repositioning the equipment shelving. She was telling us how to defend the tent. Webb said her name, just that, her name as a question. She turned back to the entrance. She said, without turning around, that she was going to need to know if he wanted her to maintain the nursing role or whether the situation called for something else. That was the sentence. That was the moment where the outline I had been carrying for 3 weeks became something with edges sharp enough to hold. Webb looked at me. I looked at Webb. Neither of us said anything for 2 or 3 seconds, and in those seconds I ran through everything again. The calibration, the northwest corner, the trauma comm, the restricted years, the jargon, and I felt the last piece of the frame click into place with the particular finality of something that had always been true and had simply been waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. Webb said, quietly, that he was going to need to make a call. He stepped outside the tent. I heard him on the comm, not the words, but the tone, the specific clipped cadence that meant he was escalating information upward. I heard Kessler's voice in response. A pause. Then Kessler's voice again, different, not alarmed, but recalibrated, the sound of someone integrating new information rapidly. Inside the tent, Vasquez had not moved from the entrance. Her posture was the same. Whatever was happening on the comm outside, she was not performing awareness of it. She was watching the northwest approach with the settled, practiced attention of someone who had watched approaches like this before, in places where the consequence of missing something was not a report filed after the fact, but a decision made in the moment with no opportunity for revision. I stood in the center of the tent for a moment, and I tried to locate the feeling in my chest. It was not fear, exactly. It was something closer to the feeling you get when a long-held assumption releases, a kind of vertiginous relief mixed with the discomfort of understanding how much you had been operating on an incorrect foundation. I had been looking at this woman through the frame of what her badge said she was, and the frame had been wrong from the beginning. Not wrong because she had misrepresented herself. I did not yet know the full shape of her history. Wrong because the frame was too small, and I had kept fitting her into it anyway, because the alternative required asking questions I had not been ready to ask. I was ready now. The armed group did not breach the base. I want to be clear about that because the story of what happened matters more in its details than in any dramatic summary, and the detail is that the perimeter held. The response was coordinated, and the group withdrew after approximately 22 minutes of sustained threat posture without a direct engagement occurring inside the wire. What happened inside the medical tent during those 22 minutes is the part that has stayed with me. Kessler came through on the comm to Webb midway through the event and said 3 words that I heard clearly from where I was standing: clear her access. That was all. Webb acknowledged. And then Webb looked at Vasquez and said that Kessler had authorized expanded operational latitude for her, and he said it the way you say something when you are still processing what it means. Vasquez nodded. She said she understood. And then she turned fully toward the tent and began directing the emergency configuration of the space with a specificity and a command authority that was categorically different from anything I had seen from her in the preceding 3 weeks. She was not doing nursing. She was doing something that encompassed nursing the way a larger structure encompasses a smaller one, clinical knowledge fully present, fully integrated, but operating inside a framework of tactical awareness and command decision-making that belongs to a different kind of training entirely. She placed me at the left flank of the tent entrance, gave me a specific instruction about what to watch for and what to call if I saw it. She repositioned the equipment shelving exactly as she had described, creating a secondary barrier on the vulnerable side that would slow but not stop a close-quarters incursion. She identified the 2 most defensible positions in the tent for non-combatant personnel. She did all of this in under 4 minutes, talking as she moved, quiet and direct, each instruction precisely calibrated to what the situation required. Webb did not question any of it. He executed. I executed. That is the other thing worth noting. We followed her direction without resistance, and not because we were confused or overwhelmed. We followed it because the authority of it was earned in real time, in the way that all genuine authority is earned, through the clarity and accuracy of the assessment behind it, made visible in the moment. The comm traffic from the perimeter told us the situation was holding. At the 18-minute mark, Kessler reported that the group had pulled back to a position beyond engagement range. At 22 minutes, the all-clear signal began its cycle. The tent went quiet. Vasquez stood at the entrance for another full minute watching before she moved away from it. Then she went to the supply table and began the post-emergency inventory, methodical, routine, exactly what the protocol called for, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. As though the previous 22 minutes had been simply another item on the shift. Webb and I looked at each other across the tent. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Webb said carefully that we should probably wait for Kessler. Kessler arrived 12 minutes later. The team filed in behind him: Reyes, Torres, Nakamura, Grant. They came into the tent and they stood for a moment in the reconfigured space, looking at the repositioned shelving, the cleared lanes, the specific arrangement of the room, and they understood, each of them in the order that they were capable of understanding, what they were looking at. Reyes was quiet. That was how I knew it had landed. Reyes, who managed everything with the performance of lightness, was standing still with his hands at his sides and his mouth closed. Kessler looked at Vasquez. He said her name. Her rank, the one on her badge. She looked at him with the same steady attention she had turned on everything from the first day. He said the records request had been redirected to a joint oversight office, and that the response he had received that evening, the one he had received after Webb's escalation on the comm, had included a brief and a set of authorizations that clarified her actual role, her actual background, and the actual reason the earlier sections of her file had been restricted. He said her background was not nursing. She said evenly that her background included nursing, that everything on her qualification record was accurate, that she had not misrepresented her credentials. He said he understood that. He said he was referring to the 4 years prior to her nursing qualification. She looked at him. Then she said what she had done for those 4 years. She said it without ceremony, branch, role, assignment type, deployment count. She said it the way you state a fact that is not in dispute, in a room full of people who no longer have any context for disputing it. The tent was very quiet when she finished. Reyes sat down slowly on the edge of one of the equipment cases. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at Vasquez with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not embarrassment, not apology, but a kind of raw, unperformed reckoning. The look of someone confronting in one moment the full distance between what he had assumed and what was actually true. He did not say anything. None of them did, not immediately. And in the silence, Vasquez returned to the post-emergency inventory. I did not sleep after the all-clear. The base moved into its post-incident rhythm, reports, assessments, the administrative machinery of documenting what had happened and what had been done. And I moved through the required parts of it. And then I sat outside the medical tent in the pre-dawn dark, and I stayed there for a long time. What was happening in me was not simple enough to call a single feeling. It was layered the way that realizations are when they arrive not as news but as confirmations. When you understand that you have known something in some form for longer than you have been willing to admit, and the full acknowledgement of it requires also acknowledging the shape of your avoidance. I had known she was more than her title. I had known it from the calibration sequence. I had built the case methodically, note by note, observation by observation, and I had kept the case inside my own head while the team around me processed her through a frame that was clearly insufficient, and I had watched that processing and said nothing that might have changed it. Why? That was the question I sat with in the dark. Part of the answer was procedural. Kessler had a records request in, and the appropriate response was to wait for the records. That was real and defensible. But it was not the whole answer, and I had enough honesty left to know it. The fuller answer was that changing the frame required saying something that would disrupt the team's existing dynamic, would require me to advocate for a position that could be wrong, could be received as the kind of overthinking that Reyes had already named, could cost me something in how the team read my judgment. And the team's read of my judgment was something I had spent 2.5 deployments building and did not want to risk on an instinct I could not prove. That is what it cost. Vasquez operating inside a frame that did not fit her, for 3 weeks, in a confined environment with people who had already decided at a comfortable level of certainty what she was, that was the cost of my risk calculation. And the fact that it had not resulted in catastrophic harm, that the situation had resolved without the kind of consequence it might have had, did not make the calculation any better in retrospect. It made it matter less in the final outcome. It did not make it more right. I thought about the 22 minutes. I thought about Kessler saying clear her access and the change that came over the tent after that, the way the room reorganized around a clarity that had always been there but had not been permitted to be visible. I thought about Reyes sitting on the equipment case, looking at the floor. There is something particular about seeing a person like Reyes reckoning. He was not a bad person. None of them were bad people. They were people who had been given a label for someone and had used the label as a complete description and had not looked past it, because looking past it was not required and required effort and potentially cost something. The label had been nurse. The label had been sufficient for the purpose, until the moment it catastrophically was not. I had done the same thing in the softer version. I had questioned the label, built the case against it, and then held the case privately rather than bringing it into the room where it could be tested and either confirmed or disproven. I had done the effortful part of seeing, and then failed at the consequential part, which is saying what you see. Vasquez had been a Marine before she was a nurse. 4 years of service, 2 of them in roles that the abbreviated briefing Kessler shared with us made clear were not administrative. She had come back from that, retrained, built a second set of skills on top of the first, and had deployed in the nursing role without apparent need for anyone to know the full picture. She was not performing humility. She simply did not require the recognition. She had been exactly who she was from the beginning, inside a frame that was too small for her, and she had worked within it without complaint and without correcting it. And when the frame had needed to break open, it had broken open on its own, under its own weight. I sat outside in the dark, and I thought about what that kind of patience costs. The sustained quiet of someone who knows more than the room gives them credit for and chooses not to correct it, not because they are passive, but because they have learned, from specific and costly experience, that the correction is only meaningful when the room is finally capable of receiving it. I understood that kind of patience intellectually. I was less certain I could have maintained it with the same lack of visible cost. And that distinction, between the understanding of a thing and the capacity for it, felt important to sit with honestly, even if sitting with it was uncomfortable. The sun came up. I went back inside. The formal documentation of what had occurred took several days, as these things do. Reports were filed through proper channels. The incident was reviewed at levels above our base command, and the records restriction on Vasquez's file was addressed in the manner that cleared records restrictions are addressed, with a quiet, administrative finality that changed the official picture without ceremony. What changed on the ground was more immediate and more human. Kessler spoke to the full team the morning after the incident. He did not make a speech about it. That was not Kessler's way, and it would have been wrong for the moment regardless. He stated what had occurred, stated what had been disclosed about Vasquez's background, and stated that her operational conduct during the incident had reflected exceptional judgment and had contributed materially to the effective management of the tent during the active threat period. He said this in the same factual tone he used for after-action assessments. Then he said the team would adjust its working relationship with her accordingly. He said it as though this were obvious and procedural, which it was. That was the correct approach. Reyes asked to speak to Vasquez directly. I know this because he told me afterward, in the abbreviated way Reyes sometimes told me things when he was taking them seriously. He said he had found her in the medical tent and had said without preface that he had underestimated her and had let that underestimation show in his conduct, and that was on him. He said she had listened to this without expression and then had asked him if there was anything that needed to be done before the next supply check. He said it with a small, complicated movement of his mouth that was not quite a smile. He said she had not given him anything to hold. He meant she had not accepted his acknowledgement as the beginning of a new social dynamic, had not become warmer or more accessible in response to his honesty. She had simply continued being who she was, which was exactly who she had been from the beginning. That was, I think, the most clarifying part of the aftermath. She did not change. She had no reason to change. She had not been waiting for the team's recognition to become the fullest version of herself. She had been that person already, inside a frame that was too small for her, and the breaking of the frame had not expanded her. It had only expanded what we were able to see. The operational dynamics shifted in the remaining weeks of the deployment in ways that were functional and real, but not dramatic. She was consulted differently, not just on medical questions, but on the kind of environmental and threat-adjacent assessments that her background actually qualified her to address. She contributed without performance. The team received her contributions without the previous ambient dismissal. It was not a transformation. People do not transform in 3 weeks. What it was an adjustment, a slow, effortful, authentic adjustment by a group of people who had been wrong and were choosing, individually and collectively, to be less wrong going forward. Torres told me one afternoon that he had looked up the unit designation she had mentioned in Kessler's briefing. He said what he found was not something he had known much about, and that learning it had given him a different sense of what certain people carry around in their daily experience that is not visible unless you know to look. He said it quietly, as an observation rather than a confession. Nakamura said nothing to me about it directly, but I noticed that whenever Vasquez was in the mess tent, Nakamura positioned herself nearby, not intrusively, not with obvious intent, but consistently. As though proximity to someone who had demonstrated that quality of capability and composure was worth something in itself. The base received a commendation in its after-incident review that noted the effective management of non-combatant personnel during the threat event. The specific actions that had informed that effective management were documented in the internal report. The documentation was accurate. Her name was in it, in the appropriate place, without editorial comment. She did not mention the commendation. She did not display it. She probably read it once, filed it in whatever internal archive she maintained for such things, and moved on to the next shift. That was the thing about her from beginning to end. She was always already moving on to the next shift. She left when the deployment cycle ended, same as the rest of us. No send-off beyond what the logistics of departure required. She loaded her gear, confirmed her transfer orders, and was gone on the same transport that took half the base personnel out in the rotation. I watched the vehicle leave from the perimeter, the same perimeter she had assessed with her eyes every morning from the entrance of the medical tent. I have thought a great deal about what I take from this. Not as a lesson I can summarize neatly. It was not that kind of experience, and flattening it into a lesson would dishonor its actual weight. What I take from it is something more like a revision, a correction applied not to a belief but to a habit of perception. I had trusted my training and my experience and my team's collective judgment as an adequate apparatus for seeing what was in front of me. It was not adequate. It produced a picture that was missing something large and essential, and the missing thing was not hidden. It was visible from the first day to anyone willing to look past the frame that had been placed around it. The frame was her title. That was all. One word on a badge and a set of assumptions attached to it that ran deep enough to override evidence accumulating in plain sight. She had known this would happen. I believe that now with the confidence of hindsight. She had known it and she had chosen the role anyway, and she had done her work inside the insufficient frame without bitterness and without appeal, and she had been ready when ready was required. That kind of readiness does not come from nowhere. It comes from a history of being underestimated and choosing, each time, not to let the underestimation become the truth. She had made that choice repeatedly at cost, in ways that I will likely never fully account for. I do not know where she went after the rotation. I know what she left behind. She left a northwest corner that I will never look at the same way again.